I think it was in Jason's talk last week that the Kungan got mentioned. The whole universe is on fire. Through what kind of samadhi can you escape being burned? Um, Feel that for a second. Feel what our lives have been like for the last few months. Feel what our lives have been like for the last few weeks. Just sense what it means for the whole universe to be on fire. And of course, you can quibble about whether the whole universe is on fire or just our little space in the universe. But nonetheless, we're in one of those moments that probably happen pretty rarely, where things have opened, things are quite painful, people are dying, people are being murdered, people are protesting against that racial injustice. There's all sorts of things happening. And I'm not naive enough to believe all this is going to last. But if you look at public opinion, there's been this huge shift. Somehow, unbeknownst to us, and really, let's put it this way, I know for myself, there's often a sense that things are solid. Things are the way they are, and nothing's going to shift that. And then every once in a while, something happens that reminds us that things aren't as solid and as set as we believed. I remember back in the late 1980s when the Soviet Union was beginning to disintegrate, and then in a matter of, I don't know, a few years, it was gone. The shock, the disbelief, the sense that since I was born into a situation where there was this conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, we were being sent underneath our desks when I was a kid to prepare for nuclear bombs. And suddenly this behemoth that I had felt was so solid and so permanent, poof, it disappeared and everything changed. And if you look at public opinion these days, now again, I'm not naive enough to believe that it's going to stay this way. But just for this moment in time, suddenly there's this huge shift. People who have felt one way up until a week ago suddenly have changed. So while the whole universe is on fire, we don't understand the fire. We don't know if the fire is good or if it's bad. We don't know what's going to happen next. We fall into a kind of sleepiness where we just believe things are permanent. But one of the Buddha's main teachings was that everything is impermanent. But we don't believe that. We always feel like it's permanent. And even when we fight against it, we're often, with our beliefs, keeping things held in one place. But this moment can teach us the truth of impermanence, to perceive with our own eyes and with our own hearts that things are always in flux. And we do our work, we try to help, and then when we least expect it, something happens, and everything is different and new and fresh and possible. So I think it's important for all of us to keep that in our minds and our hearts, to not fall victim to our own mistaken beliefs about permanence. Look at your life. Just when you think it's stuck, then you notice, no, it's changed. Change is always happening. We just don't keep up with it. Our minds, our consciousness keeps things fixed. But in truth, everything is always in flux. From the moment we're born, we're heading towards death. We don't know when that will happen, but it's guaranteed. What happens along the way is always changing. If we lose something that we love, we think that change is terrible. But in a moment where things may be changing in a way that brings the culture more in alignment with mine or yours or others' beliefs, then we like it. But for all those people who like it, there's the other side that doesn't like it. So like and dislike is subject to our own belief system. But fundamentally, things are always in flux. It's a dynamic process. It's alive. It's not a dead image. Everything is alive, pulsating, vibrating, changing. The whole universe is on fire. The second half of that Kangan says, through what kind of samadhi will you escape being burned? That phrase, it's a hook. We're always looking for a way out. We're always looking for a way to save ourselves. But if the whole universe is on fire, there's nowhere to go. Pema Chodron called this the wisdom of no escape. Here we are. There's nowhere to go. There's no alternative universe that will quench the fire. Each one of us has our own obligation to manage and work with the fire, because we ourselves are on fire. So when we give up the fantasy of escape, then we can settle in, really try to perceive what is it, and then find our way to help. That's our Bodhisattva way. That's Buddhist practice. Those of you who've heard me give talks over the years, and for those of you who are more new to our Wednesday night talks, I gave a talk around Buddha's birthday where I spoke about the trouble that I've always had with the story of the Buddha. The story goes where he's born into this wealthy family, and his father conspires with the help to keep the Buddha, who was then just, I guess he was called Shakyamuni, no, he was called Gautama, but to keep his son away from the truth of sickness, old age, poverty, and death. And every time I look at that story, it feels like a silly, crazy story for me, because people are aging all the time. There's change happening. What happened as the young boy grew up? The people who cared for them would die. So the story never made sense to me, and I saw it as an elaborate lie perpetrated in order to control him. And then this year, I had a revelation. It was that it's not that the Buddha didn't know about it, it's just that he didn't care. And in the face of what has been happening in our country these last couple of weeks, I've now turned it a little bit more, and I realized that it was just the privilege that he had that allowed him to not care. His privilege blinded him to the pain and suffering that was around him. And that cry of recognition of privilege is part of what's going on in our world these days. For all of us, no matter what our circumstances, to recognize our own privilege and to see how that privilege blinds us to the suffering and the pain of others. So when the Buddha went, finally he realized that he hadn't cared, but he still didn't know what to do. So he went off into the forest and he practiced intently for 6 years. In many ways, trying to break through the blindness that was created by his privilege. So it takes work. It takes practice. It takes inquiry to look into whatever our privilege is and to be able to see how it manifests, to notice how it functions, and really to dig deep inside. And now I'm going to give you an editorial comment. but to see how it impoverishes ourselves. That the thing that we think is what's saving us is actually what impoverishes us and increases and multiplies the suffering that we have to deal with. So we've all been called to look into ourselves in this moment. What am I? What are the circumstances of my life? What is my privilege? And doing the work to discover it and to find a way to let it go. In Buddhism, we often say at the end of a ceremony, there's a chant which says, we offer the merits of this practice to all beings. So in a way, you can say, we offer the benefits of this privilege to all beings. Then we're stripped naked. We're open, alive, and present in this world. And you can pick up every time you hear me talk, it's about being open, alive, and present in this moment. And if we hide behind our privilege, we're not there. We're hiding in that bunker that we laugh at others for going into. But look into your own bunker. See the way you hide out and protect yourself. That's the essence of our practice. Not to be perfect, but to investigate, explore, and inquire into that question, what am I? And if you really do that with honesty and perseverance, you start to crack the veneer and open and become, like I said, more naked, more present, and more alive. Doesn't mean you won't make mistakes. We're constantly making mistakes. What do we do? Those mistakes help us wake up and help others. So I want to tell a little personal story here. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, one of the changes that happened in my neighborhood was that my local cemetery closed. Again, those of you who know me, who have listened to my talks, you hear me talking about, I spend a lot of time in that cemetery. My main exercise, I've been in my house now for, I don't know, about 25 years. And for 25 years, I've had that cemetery to walk up into the hills, to wander around, to get these wonderful views of San Francisco and the bay in front of it. From some places, I get 4 different bridges that I can see. It's just this magnificent place. It was designed by the same man who designed Central Park in New York. So they closed down. So ironically, through this time period, what I've actually increased is my walking and my exercise. So now I've lost my main territory of walking, and I've entered into my neighborhood in a way that I hadn't before. Of course, I've been here 25 years. I live in my neighborhood. I do walk in the neighborhood. But as I've been walking, what I noticed is that I had set up boundaries in my neighborhood. I'd get to the top of the hill, and then the street would go down. And I decided, okay, that's far enough. I don't want to go down that hill. So that I had these boundaries around the terrain where I was walking. And it was a little bit conscious. I mean, I would notice when I decided not to walk over the hill. But as I've now ventured down that hill and up the next hill, suddenly my territory is much wider. And at one point, I got this feeling that I understood a little bit better how boundaries between communities happen. It's like you get to the top of the hill and you decide, no, I'm not going to go any further. And then the people who live on the other side of the hill, maybe they get to the top of the hill and they say, oh, no, I'm not going to go any further. So suddenly we have a boundary between communities. But what I noticed is the boundaries that I create in my own mind. There's no boundary. I walk up and down plenty of hills, but oh, I don't want to go down towards that street. No, I'm not going to go down in that direction. No, it's far enough over. There's a main street over here. I won't cross it. And of course, this is a metaphor. I realize how much my mind gets narrow and defined by self-imposed boundaries. And it was only because something that I didn't like happened and I had to change my behavior was I able to see the boundaries that I had been creating all along. Our basic practice is practicing into this question, what am I? To me, that puts us right directly in front of our boundaries. But I'd been practicing for 25 years while I had been in this house. Still, I didn't notice the boundary. It took a change in my everyday life for me to notice. So all of our lives are different now. The background has shifted a little bit. It's a beautiful moment for practice because everything's a little bit different. Our lives are a little bit shaken up. Our usual tendency is to try to put it back together really quickly and go back into the fantasy of the boundaries that we create. But if we're really Zen practitioners, we go into it rather than retreat away from it. We discover who we are by discovering the impediments that we put up in front of us. And many of you have heard the phrase, the Buddhist phrase, everything is created by mind alone. Everything is mediated through our consciousness. We think the tree in front of us is outside of ourselves and separate. But the only way we know the tree is how it comes through our consciousness. If we touch the tree, we feel it. That feeling gets mediated through our consciousness. When we see something, that vision, that light comes through our eyes and goes into our brain, and our consciousness interprets it. Everything is mediated through mind. So unless we're willing to look into mind, we don't know how things are mediated. So last week at the Dharma talk, an interesting question came up. I think it was from Ben, who happens to not be here tonight because of his schoolwork. He said that in Zen, he asked the question, he said, in Zen, we're always taught to challenge and question the story. But in diversity work, we're often told to listen to the stories of, in our present day case, you might say, if we're talking about Black Lives Matter, then we're talking about listen to the stories that African Americans have to tell us, to open up to the story. But so the question is, on one hand, we're saying challenge the story, and on the other hand, we're being told to listen to the story. So how does that fit with our Zen practice? And too often, we might respond to somebody's story with, don't be attached to your story. That's only your mind talking. And just as a first cut at this question, I think it's important for all of us to remember that practice isn't a weapon to use on other people. So Zen Master Bon Soeng used to have a phrase. He used to say, put it all down, which meant don't hold on to your opinion. But what started to happen around the Zen Center is whenever you disagreed with what somebody else was saying, you'd say, put it all down. You're attached to your idea. Not acknowledging that I'm also attached to mine. But practice isn't a weapon to use against other people. Practice is about, what am I doing right now? To be questioning, inquiring, wondering, what is this? What am I? But there's also another important point, which is that too often a question like this puts us into either or thinking. It's either good or it's bad. It's white or it's black. It's up or it's down. And if we say, question your story, how can I listen to somebody else's story? There's something that doesn't connect. But to me, Buddhist practice teaches us it's a both and world. It's not question your story and don't listen to somebody else's story. It's listen and challenge your own assumptions. It's not saying you're not using your practice to challenge somebody else's assumptions. We're saying listen to the stories, take it in, and let that challenge your experience. There's another way I'd like to talk about this. I think you all know I'm a psychotherapist. And sometimes I say to people that Zen practice and psychotherapeutic practice are very similar. They're both about liberation and freedom. They're both about investigating suffering and finding a way to become free. Where in Zen we might say, question your story. As a psychotherapist, I'm working with people's story, and I'm helping to use that story so that a person can see their patterns better. When we tell a narrative, that narrative tells you something about ourselves. If we listen to our narrative, it's a little bit like a Rorschach test, or another word for it is a projective test. You lay out a story, and then you respond to that story. How you respond to that story tells you something about your own mind. So we have to make room to hear and to listen to people's experience and use that to help ourselves wake up. The more clear we are, when we listen to other people's stories, we can hear how much we don't understand. How many things haven't occurred to us because those experiences haven't happened to us. So by listening deeply to somebody else's story, we can actually challenge our own sense of I-ness and what we believe is reality. None of us know what reality is. We only know what we experience and how we interpret it. You know, this is almost a silly example, but it occurs to me as I'm speaking. It's sometimes, you know, you can't, well, you see this wall behind me. I call it, it's kind of a shade of blue. It's not a clear color to give an easy answer for. It's easier if I could just point, maybe I could point to the door and we could say the door is white. And probably everybody watching me will agree that the door is white. But actually, none of us know what anybody else is experiencing. You've been calling what you're experiencing white your whole life. So we agree on the name, but we don't know what anybody else's experience is. We only know that we agree on the name for it. My point mostly is just to use the moment to challenge our assumptions. When you're listening to somebody else's story, one way of listening is to try to poke holes in this story. What you're trying to get someone to see is that you're right. Another way to listen to people's stories is to hear things that you don't know about and take it in and use what you're learning to challenge your own story. We always want somebody else to change. If you become more like me, then we're both going to be a lot more happy, right? Maybe, maybe not. But if you use that to allow yourself to change, then everything is different. Then you're in a new moment. Our Zen practice is about possibility. It's about the mystery and the aliveness of this very moment. Unless we challenge our assumptions, unless we use everything we're learning in this very moment and turn it back inward and use it to poke holes in the certainty of who we believe we are. If we don't do that, we're really not practicing. We're just doing something to help maintain our ego. But Zen practice is about taking a chisel and a hammer and finding the fault that you can go boom, and it opens up. It's like a diamond cutter. Finds just the right place to hit it, and the beauty of the diamond gets revealed. That's what practice is about. Our practice is like cutting a diamond. And if we hit it right, our true self emerges. That which we already are, the energy that is available to us in the universe opens up. And then we can offer it to help the world. Each of us has our own way of helping the world. Nobody in our Zen tradition, we don't tell you what to believe. We don't tell you what to do. Probably most of us on this call or on this online tonight, we're probably somewhere closely aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement. But some may not be. And that's okay too. I might argue with you, you might argue with me, but that's not the point. Our practice isn't about telling you what to believe. Our practice is about helping you get beyond your beliefs, to contact the raw, aliveness that's available to us, and find a way to harness it and to use it to help the world. You're going to do it in a different way than I am. If you feel you've got to do it my way, you're in trouble, because it may not resonate with who you are, what your true nature has to offer. Again, we're practicing like diamond cutters. Hit the right point. Allow your true self to be revealed, and allow that true self to connect and interact with the rest of the universe. So while the universe may be on fire, still, what can you do to help? How can you be alive and connected enough to offer what it is that your gift is? And for that we practice, not just a little bit. For better or worse, this takes a lot of hard work. So we say practice every day, whether if you're talking about your formal practice. For some people, the best we can do is 5 minutes. For some, it's just chanting Kwanzaa Bosal during the day. For others, it's a half an hour. Some it's an hour. Some people do it once a day. Some people do it twice a day. I would encourage you to do it as much as you can, but each one of you will find your way for how you integrate your formal practice in your life. But then there's your everyday life practice. Every moment is practice. Every moment we're faced with something. We're in the midst of something. And how are you keeping your mind? Is your awareness right on that edge? What am I doing right now? What do I experience right now? Use your body. Our whole body-mind system, we're both receivers and transmitters. We're both. Some of us are better at receiving and maybe have more trouble with transmitting. Other of us are great transmitters, but we're not too good at receiving. We're all on that continuum in some way. Find your place and then work to increase both of them. To practice means to be so finely tuned that you can hear the cries of the world. To express our nature is to transmit what you've heard and offer it to all beings. So we're both cultivating our deep receptive quality and our deep expressive quality. It's a both and world. Wherever we're strongest, then we have to put our attention to where we're weaker. Don't be afraid of, I'm struggling to find the right word for it. Don't be afraid of your imperfections. Everybody is imperfect. Some practitioners like to believe when the Buddha had his final enlightenment, he got rid of all his imperfections and he was perfect. One Theravadan monk on one trip I took with the quantum school claimed the Buddha was omniscient. The Buddha knew everything. I said, well, what about TV? Did he know about television? And he said, yeah, he knew about that. That's not my belief system, but maybe I'm wrong. But the Buddha was also the one who didn't want to allow women into the Sangha. And it took his aunt who raised him to cajole and argue and push him to where he changed his view. And even when he changed his view, he didn't like that he changed his view, and he thought that it was going to lead to an early ending of the Buddha way. So I don't know. I wouldn't call that perfect and omniscient. But what I love about that story is that she pushed. She raised him. She had a way that probably the rest of the people around him didn't have because he was so high up at the pinnacle. But she could poke at him. And finally, for better or worse, he changed. He listened. So even the Buddha had to be pushed and cajoled. He still needed to recognize that his privilege was blinding him. We're never done. Our practice goes on because our practice opens us. There's always something more to see. So use your practice in a loving, kind, and compassionate way towards yourself and towards others. Use that, help cultivate that receptivity and cultivate that transmission that each of us are capable of giving.